We began last time our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upanishad. And as a first step, entering into this study, we dwelt on the condition and the state of consciousness in which we have to approach such a study. Sri Aurobindo points out that the human mind has a tendency to read what it expects into its study of the more ancient texts. When we read those ancient documents, we tend instinctively to seek for confirmation of what we already know, rather than to learn from them what they have to teach. In order properly to absorb what the ancient rishis have passed on to us, he says we have to enter passively into the thoughts of the old rishis, allow their words to sink into our souls, mold them, and create their own reverberations in a sympathetic and responsive material. Submissiveness, in short, to the Shruti was the theory the ancients themselves had of their method of Vedic knowledge. Giram upashrutim chara, stoman abhiswara, abhigrinihi aruva. To listen in soul to the old voices and allow the Shruti in the soul to respond, to vibrate, first obscurely, in answer to the Vedantic hymn of knowledge, to give the response, the echo, and last, to let that response gain in clarity, intensity, and fullness. This is the principle of interpretation that I have followed, Sri Aurobindo says. Mystical perhaps, but not necessarily more unsound than the insistence and equally personal standards of the logician and the scholar. This has been the approach with which we will also seek to follow Sri Aurobindo as he leads us into this study. We saw last time that the Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upanishad is also, according to Sri Aurobindo, the most obscure and profoundest of the Upanishads. Its ideas are remote from us, its language is still more remote. Profound, subtle, extraordinarily rich in rare philosophical suggestion and delicate psychology. So because things are couched, he says, in symbolism, to us it is as if an obscuring veil. But to the contemporaries of the rishis, who would have been used to that dialect, it would have been a noble frame for its riches. This we had read last time, but before we proceed, it is worth dwelling on why the symbolism is such a noble frame. Last time in our study, we had a brief glimpse of the sense of the image that the Bṛhadāraṇyaka leads us to of the horse of the worlds. We had a glimpse of the sense of this movement of a stupendous energy rushing forward, becoming the worlds. The word Ashwa, the horse, the word Ashwa itself in its root represents being, existence, substance. And it is this movement to manifest that is this great horse of the world. But as it moves into manifestation, it must see what it chooses to manifest. And so the eyes of the horse are the sun which sees. And as it sees, it becomes what it sees and moves into manifestation. His breath is the wind. And the wind because it's the basis of life. Life we tend to view only in terms of living beings, living systems, biological systems. But to the occult vision, the whole movement of unfolding manifestation is life itself. And so the breath of the horse is this life force. As it moves, it breathes into being, it breathes into manifestation, this whole living universe. And his wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. In the Sanskrit text, the fire is described as Vaishvanara, a universal power. Sri Aurobindo explains that the fire is strength, expansion. And so as this seeing power moves, breathing life into manifestation, it also, through the open mouth, manifests fire, the universal creative fire. And all of these, we need to lean back to the Vedic symbolism, even for these details. The sun is the sun of truth, the divine creative power of supermind which casts into form in order the entire manifestation, makes cosmos instead of chaos. And that is that seeing eye. The breath of life, Vayu, is in fact the movement of force that creates the universe, which modern science sees as this dynamic energy. Science recognizes two poises of energy. An energy which is passive, holding in potential, and an energy that moves into force. And this Vayu is the moving into force of what we call energy. But if we were to pause and ask, what is the energy which moves? We have no answer. Science has no answer. There is something that's moving. What it is we cannot describe, but we only see in it a power to work, a power to effectuate, to change, to do something. What is that power? We have no words, and it goes beyond the domain of science, and we say that is metaphysics. But to the Vedic Rishi, it is the divine himself as power, moving, entering into movement, and dynamically forming the universe. And the nature of this movement, Vayu, is that it cannot be still, it has to move. And to cast into form a stable appearance, it moves in rhythm, repeating. So the whole universe is seen as a gigantic ocean of this moving force, which is the breath, the wind, Vayu, of this horse, the cosmic horse. And fire, again, in the Vedic symbolism, is the will, the Agni, which is the divine will, or the power of tapas, concentration of consciousness. Wherever there is a concentration of consciousness, there is heat, there is electricity, there is light. And the whole material experience of heat, light, and electricity, you see how closely they are connected. But they are all facets in material expression of pure tapas, pure concentration of energy, of consciousness. And so the wide open mouth of this cosmic horse is fire, but a universal fire, Vaishvanara. It is in the Vedic symbol that power which casts into form what is otherwise formless. In terms of physical science, we see the whole universe as a blank emptiness, what we call empty space. And yet in that empty space we see a seething ocean of particles appearing and disappearing at each moment. Virtual, we say, because they seem to have no stability, no reality in the conventional sense. And yet they are there. And somehow, in this seething ocean of virtual particles, they attach themselves to each other in such a way that although they are unstable, mutually they become stable. As the first changes into the second changes into the first, and the two together appear as if a stable pair, although internally they are virtual and unstable. What magical power draws out of this apparent chaos of nothingness this stable appearance of form and keeps it held, keeps it stable? Otherwise, left to itself, things would simply lapse back into that virtual seething chaos of emptiness. It is this will of the divine, Agni, which binds together, holds together, and chooses the form in which it wants to manifest. It casts into form. So in the Veda, Agni is always described as the creator of form. And here in this image of the sacrificial horse, his wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. On a cosmic level, it forms as the creative power all that is brought into manifestation. And all this while, it was just the description of the frontal part of the horse. And then time and the back of the horse, the belly, the footing, the flanks, etc., are all described as representative of different facets of the cosmos. And we do not go into the details now, but this we use to recall what we had read last time and see the power of the symbol. The symbol is not merely an allegory. Very often, when people speak of symbolism, they speak of some association. For example, someone wears a medallion, perhaps, or the symbol of the mother or Sri Aurobindo is inscribed on a paper. And we see the symbol merely as somehow representing in capsule form, in essential form, something else which is too big, too complex to be represented. And this is how the surface sense mind trivializes symbol. But the true sense of symbol is the representation on a lower level, the truth of a higher level. This is how Sri Aurobindo explains it. The truth of a higher level, which can only manifest in its own domain, in its own substance, if it is now brought to be represented on a lower level which cannot hold that truth, well, it takes a diminished, a reduced, abstracted form, and that is symbol. It is that truth represented here on a lower level. If we were to now take a few examples, when you have a beautiful experience of a scene from the top of a mountain, you sketch it out. It's a pattern of lead powder on paper. You go back home and show it to others. And somehow, if the sketch is sufficiently living, as they gaze at it, they can feel something of the experience that you had. The same idea is done in a more complex way, more accurately with a camera today, where the picture is drawn first by a coating of silver powder, today with other chemicals and dyes, but you have a photograph, and looking at the photo, you have a sense of something of what that experience was like. And then if you concentrate on the photo, sometimes it's as if the frame of the photo becomes a window and your consciousness bursts through to the fullness of the experience. You are as if transported to another world, another domain, beyond the range of your material senses, and you have the experience. We have this especially sometimes when looking at sacred images, images of spiritual beings, and we are as if pulled into their consciousness. This is the true sense of symbol. It is the truth itself represented on a lower level, which is incapable of holding the truth in its entirety. Now, when we look at this in terms of the human mind, we see how important it is. When there is the highest truth of this cosmos exists on a domain above mind. But when the human mind turns to try to receive that truth, it is incapable. It is like the paper on which somehow that oceanic scene needs to be represented, and of course it will be lost. It will be flattened out, distorted, diminished. So the human mind as a recording instrument is incapable of holding that reality. Sri Aurobindo explains in one of his commentaries that the power which manifested the universe is not mind, is not rational mind. It's not intellect. And therefore intellect is incapable of understanding the universe. It can understand superficially. But the moment it crosses certain limits, it finds itself in a paradox. Is it a wave or a particle? Is it matter or is it energy? Is it force or is it energy? Is it electrical or is it material? Is it a field or is it a form? We see these dualities and contradictions and we find mind unable to heal them in the only means that it has, which is logic and representation in symbols of formulas. Because that which creates the universe is above mind and uses a means of cognition which is greater than mind, which mental formula cannot capture. And if the true vision of the cosmos is to be had, it can only be had in that domain in which the creation takes place. We have to be able to rise to that level of cognition to be able to envision, experience, and know the universe. The universe can be known, but not in the domain of the intellect, but by a supra-rational consciousness. And yet, we don't have that yet. We need to rise to it through the intellect. And so there is a need for the intellect to begin to understand as far as it can go, and then the consciousness has to rise beyond intellect to know further. And so in the first step, when the intellect turns to know, it must necessarily receive that vision and experience in a diminished form in symbol. And if the mind rushes to catch the experience and reduce it to what it is used to knowing, it will of course distort it. But if the mind can remain silent, allow the symbol to form, allow the truth to formulate itself, create its own body and means of expression in the domain of the intellect, and yet not distort too much, open as if a window in our mind to that which is beyond mind, to the intuitive, then even though our rational mind can appreciate, it will not be limited. Through that rational appreciation, we will move to something which transcends the rationality. It will lead us into the direct experience of that which is supra-rational. And it is this which Sri Aurobindo has described as the method of Vedic knowledge. To listen in soul to the old voices and allow the Shruti in the soul to respond, to vibrate, first obscurely, in answer to the Vedic hymn of knowledge, to give the response the echo, and last, to let that response gain in clarity, intensity, and fullness. So Sri Aurobindo offers us this bridge that allows the rational mind to reach out and perceive something, and yet open a window into that which is supra-rational. He puts it in words which are themselves symbolic, and we see now the power of the symbol more obviously. It, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it has preferred to couch its ideas in a highly figurative and symbolic language, which to its contemporaries accustomed to this suggestive dialect must have seemed a noble frame for its riches, but meets us rather as an obscuring veil. To draw aside this curtain, to translate the old Vedic language and figures into the form contemporary thought prefers to give to its ideas, is the sole object of this commentary. The task is necessarily a little hazardous. Now, before Sri Aurobindo takes this up, there have been before him others who have commented on this and other texts. Perhaps the greatest of them all was Adi Shankara, and Sri Aurobindo, in characteristic humility, gives to him the due respect to his authority and to the greatness of his intellect and his commentary, but then points out that that is not sufficient and there is need for something more, and then moves on to his own commentary. And for our study, it is worth reading this to understand what it is that Shankaracharya achieved, both in its greatness and in its limitation. It would have been easy merely to reproduce the thoughts and interpretations of Shankara in the modern tongue. If there were an error, one could afford to err with so supreme an authority. And this is the greatness, that even if there's an error, such a greatness can afford to err. But that's not enough, he says. But it seems to me that both the demands of truth and the spiritual need of mankind in this age call for a restoration of old Vedantic truth, rather than for the prolonged dominion of that single side of it, systematized by the medieval thinker. So Sri Aurobindo offers a very different view of the spiritual history of humanity. We have in the modern context been taught that the past was a period of barbarism and the modern civilization is an ascent out of barbarism. The old records of ancient cultures differ on this. They remember a period which is described as a golden age, from which there was a decline into a kind of a barbarism. And in their view, the modern culture and civilizations of the world are barbaric. Those were refined, cultured, spiritual. Sri Aurobindo, of course, does not see it merely as a decline. He sees it as a cyclic passage, intended to complete something, intended to consolidate a partial development of the intellect, and to fuse this intellectual development with the higher power of intuition, which had been awakened earlier, but with insufficient integration with the intellect, for which a descent back into intellect was necessary, and through that intellectual descent, an ascent back to intuition, bridging the two. So the demand of truth and the spiritual need of mankind in this age requires that what was in between presented is not enough. We have to go back to the old Vedantic truth. And what was presented in between, in particular by Shankaracharya, but also by others along similar lines, was a side of the truth, a facet. Again, in Sri Aurobindo's vision, every great commentator was right, was true, but partially. Each of them has taken an aspect of the truth relevant for that age, necessary for that immediate step in the progress of humanity, and each has consolidated and imprinted that aspect in the human consciousness. And if we look back at the whole journey of the last several thousand years, among the great philosophers, thinkers, and even spiritual beings and yogis, each brought forward a special aspect of the divine truth, imprinted it as his work. But today, this curve, completing the various aspects of the truth, now reaches a point where it has to reintegrate, bring back into harmony all these facets, and manifest an integral experience in which all of these are included, but there is a complete whole. It is such an experience which was the foundation of the Vedic manifestation, the Vedic age, and it is to this that he points as the old Vedic truth, in contrast to the single side of the systematized knowledge of the medieval thinker. Sri Aurobindo even makes a distinction between the old Vedanta and the later Vedanta. Most of what is taught today as Vedanta in modern India and the rest of the world is the later Vedanta, which takes an aspect, a facet of the truth. In particular, it is that facet of the truth which sees the Brahman, the absolute, separate from the world, or the world an illusion in relation to its absoluteness. And that is one aspect of the truth. The other aspect is that the world is as real, as concrete as the other side of Brahman. The world also is Brahman, and Brahman is not known entirely until you know him in its entirety, including his transcendence, including his universality, and including his materiality and individuality in the world. It is in that totality that Brahman is held. This great truth is imprinted in almost all the spiritual texts, including the Brihadaranyaka, in a single word whose profound symbolism has been lost or has been trivialized in some way. And that word is the very first word of the verse, and that is Om. Om itself, Sri Aurobindo explains, to the Vedic rishis represented something much more than what it means today. Today, we speak of the Om as the creative vibration out of which the universe is born, and so on. But Sri Aurobindo points out in his commentary on the Chandogya Upanishad that to the Vedic rishis, Om represented Brahman himself and the four statuses of Brahman in his manifestation. And I would like to read from that. The first of all, Om itself is made up of three, U and Ma, each representing different gradations. And I read from his notes on the Chandogya. He says, its subject is the Brahman, but the Brahman as symbolized in the Om, the sacred syllable of the Veda. Not therefore the pure state of the universal existence only, but that existence in all its parts, the waking world, the dream self, and the sleeping, the manifest, half manifest and hidden, bhurloka, bhuvar and swar. The right means to win all of them, enjoy all of them, transcend all of them is the subject of the Chandogya. Om is the symbol and the thing symbolized. It is the symbol, aksharam, akshara translated as letter, but the word means non-moving. The syllable in which all sound of speech is brought back to its wide, pure, indeterminate state. It is the symbolized aksharam, the changeless, undiminishing, unincreasing, unappearing, undying reality, which shows itself to experience in all this change, increase, diminution, appearance, departure, which in a particular sum and harmony of them we call the world. Just as Om, the pure eternal sound basis of speech, shows itself to the ear in the variations and combinations of the impure sound, which in a particular sum and harmony of them we call the Veda. So you see how he literally describes the appearance of the world in Om as the appearance of the Veda out of the Om. And I won't read the whole text, but you get the sense of what that Om means. So he says, Om, when the word was spoken as a solemn affirmation, everyone thought of the pranava in the Veda, but no one could listen to the word Om without thinking also of the Brahman in its triple manifestation and in its transcendent being. So this is the idea behind it when we say Om. It's not just a way of starting. It's not merely a vibration. It is the Brahman himself in his triple status and in his transcendence. A representing the objective world, U representing the inner worlds, what is described as the dream state, and the Ma representing the sleep state, and the silence into which the Ma fades is the transcendence. In fact, in the science of the bija mantras, the seed sounds, A, U and Ma have precisely this character. But we notice also in the way these sounds are articulated, A is fully open, U is half indrawn, and in the Ma, the sound is there but the mouth is not open. It's as if the consciousness sees but has not yet moved into manifestation. And this is described as the sleep state or the trance state in which the Brahman creates, conceives of the world, creates it but does not yet release it into manifestation. And in the U, he has begun to release it, and all of the subtle worlds are formed, but they all have a certain fluidity, a subjectivity. And in the the most expressed, objectivized form of this material world is cast out. But it all emerges out of the silence, and so the Om leads you back to the source, and Om represents therefore the totality of Brahman. So it is this totality to which Sri Aurobindo is alluding when he speaks of the old Vedantic truth which has to be restored, and not the single-sided, systematized expression which we see in the modern Vedanta. And of course, in the modern Vedanta, the world being illusion, the solution for the problem of the world is to withdraw from the world. But in the old Vedanta, world being a part of the Brahman's manifestation, itself as an expression of Brahman, is to be accepted as the foundation or the stage on which the divine must be manifested, the immortality of the Satchidananda must be regained and brought into this world. So it's for this spiritual need of mankind that we have to move a step further and go back to the old Vedantic truth. The great Shankaracharya needs no modern praise and can be hurt by no modern disagreement. Easily the first of metaphysical thinkers, the greatest genius in the history of philosophy, his commentary has also done an incalculable service to our race by bridging the intellectual gulf between the sages of the Upanishads and ourselves. So obviously he is the earliest of metaphysical thinkers, but he comes at an age when the metaphysical articulation became important for humanity. There was a time when the mood of the age was so different that to try to intellectualize was considered as trivializing, distorting, and was looked down upon. And that was the intuitive age. People even looked at the mind and said, oh, this is something inferior. Do not get stuck in it. It will distort, it will limit you. And we still have that teaching surviving as the basis of all of the spiritual and occult training. And yet, as the cycle moved to the completion of the intellectual development, as the cycle moved downwards, the age compelled in humanity this craving to articulate in rational terms and master the domain of intellect. And so in that transition you find all over the world these great thinkers sprouting up. To the modern mind it looks like they started the process of intellectualization which was ascending to civilization, but in the larger vision they brought down something higher to express in rational terms. In Greece you had the great thinkers such as Plato and others. In India, it was Shankaracharya, who Sri Aurobindo says is the first of metaphysical thinkers, and a genius, an extraordinary intellect, and formulating those great truths in rational terms. And therefore he says, bridging the intellectual gulf between the sages of the Upanishads and ourselves. But why was that so important? He explains, it has protected them, the Upanishads, it has protected them from the practical oblivion in which our ignorance and inertia have allowed the Veda to rest for so many centuries, only to be dragged out by the rude hands of the daringly speculative Teuton. So when this transition took place and humanity itself could no more capture the great truths of the Vedic revelation, there was need for someone who could translate it into intellectual terms so that we would still value the Veda. Otherwise, they would have been dismissed as something ancient which no one seems to understand. It has no meaning. It's something like this which archaeologists struggle with when they try to decode the hieroglyphs of the ancient Egyptians. There are profound symbols involved, and even the hieroglyphic tradition teaches of a double meaning, a spiritual meaning and a more profane meaning. And this double symbolism is typical of the Veda. There are even images, symbols which parallel the Vedic. We see, for example, in one of the classic images so popular in Egyptian literature, the image of the sun reaching out a ray, and the ray ends in a hand that holds the Ankh, the symbol of life as they translate it. And in front of that is the king or priest in worship, and it is purely a Vedic symbol, the sun of truth reaching out the ray of intuition which gifts the mind, the receiving mind, with this truth which is life. The symbol itself is Vedic, and it is not surprising because they belong to the same age, the same period of the intuitive consciousness. But the same problem is faced when the archaeologists today try to decipher those texts. They come up with passages which are translated in their profane terms, the sacred symbol is lost. But in the profane terms it makes sense, such and such king attacked such and such enemy. And then suddenly the symbol breaks and it makes no sense at all. There is, for example, a passage where the king hid his heart on top of a tree, and as long as his heart was hidden, he was immortal. He could not be killed unless someone reached to the heart which was hidden in the tree. It makes no sense at all. But if you see the word used for king, for heart, for tree, and for death, for immortality, suddenly the whole thing acquires a spiritual meaning. It is the same thing which we see also in the surviving form of the alchemical tradition in Europe, which also has a strong parallel in the Indian alchemical tradition, where the whole transformation of base metal into gold is nothing but a spiritual transformation of the substance of humanity, which is the base material, into gold, which is the substance of the gods. And suddenly the ancient language and the modern languages merge, and you see a continuity. But for that you must go back into the deeper symbol. Once that connection of the living experience is lost, and we are unable to see the symbol, we read those very texts of alchemy, and they make no sense at all. They seem like formulas which in modern times became the basis for chemistry. All of modern chemistry in Europe traces back to alchemical texts, but they only caught the most superficial symbolic mixtures of material substance. The spiritual thing is lost, and those texts have died out because people saw no value in them. And the same would have happened to the Veda and the Upanishads if not for Shankaracharya bridging this, the gulf between the sages of the Upanishads and ourselves. And the Veda similarly has been allowed to rest for centuries. Fortunately, the power of the oral tradition and something of the imprint of the experience kept alive in certain more secret lineages the power of the word, but the profounder meaning was still lost. And it was necessary for Sri Aurobindo to bring it forward once again. And he makes refer to the rude hands of the daringly speculative Teuton. And it's interesting to see how in Europe it was in the Teutonic race that the first resonance to the Vedic and Upanishadic teaching was most articulate. And not surprisingly, it was in among those especially who were not only philosophical but also rational, scientific. You would probably know that most of the scientists involved in developing quantum theory, developing the atomic technology, were familiar with Sanskrit, were avid readers of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, as well as many of the Teutonic philosophers. For example, the concept of being and becoming was introduced in Europe from the Upanishadic texts. And some of these things are a matter of history. But the point is, when the mind caught these truths through the gateway of the intellect, it caught something, it sensed a greater truth beyond an intuitive truth, but it had to first reduce it to rational terms. And then it had the satisfaction of having grasped it. But after a while, it's as if having grasped it, something still seems to slip out. And so the mind now yearns for the little more that it senses further, and it is gradually pulled into something which transcends its own limitations. But this was the first necessary phase, otherwise the truth would have been lost. So it has kept these ancient grandeurs of thought, these high repositories of spirituality, under the safeguard of that temple of metaphysics, the Advaita philosophy. So the philosophy itself, he presents in his symbolism as a temple in which those texts have been safeguarded, a little in the background, a little too much veiled and shrouded, but nevertheless safe from the iconoclasm and the restless ingenuity of modern scholarship. And you see these two tendencies in the intellect when it comes into its own. First, it wants to break It wants to break what it sees as symbols which live by themselves, because the rationality wants things to be explained in terms of logic and not an innate truth. An authority that says this is so because I see it, because I experience it, is not irrational and so must be broken. And you have this iconoclasm which sometimes takes a very crude physical form also. But on the other side, the intellect has a restless ingenuity. Having given one explanation, after a while it gets bored. And it looks for a second explanation and a different explanation. The more different from the past, the more novel, the more new, the more exciting. And it needs to maintain this ingenious invention. But neither of these methods leads you to the truth. It only develops, perfects the flexibility of the mind and the intellect. So he says, nevertheless, it remains true that Shankara's commentary is interesting, not so much for the light it sheds on the Upanishad, as for its digression into his own philosophy, because Shankara emphasized and read into this text his own philosophy. I do not think that Shankara's rational intellect, subtle indeed to the extreme, but avid of logic, of logical clearness and consistency, could penetrate far into that mystic symbolism and that deep and elusive flexibility which is characteristic of all the Upanishads, but rises to an almost unattainable height in the Bṛhadāraṇyaka. So the Upanishads always, he says, have this elusive flexibility and depth, mystic symbolism, and in the Bṛhadāraṇyaka that goes to the highest. The elusive flexibility is elusive because a single image lends itself to multiple facets. You can approach the image from one point and experience the whole thing in a certain way. You approach the same image from a different point and experience the whole thing in a different way. And so there is a great flexibility in the approach. It is the same experience you approach, but because you approach it differently, you experience it differently. And it is elusive because it needs a consciousness that is plastic enough to approach from all sides and to know from inside out. And it's deep. You can go on in layers and layers and layers. We have seen this in our study of the Isha Upanishad earlier. As we dwelt on a verse, we found so many suggestions and layers unfolding. And this Bṛhadāraṇyaka is almost unattainable in its height for all of these things. He, Shankaracharya, he has done much, has shown often a readiness and quickness astonishing in so different a type of intellectuality, but more is possible and needed. And then the text which we read already last time and we reread now, the time is fast coming when the human intellect, aware of the mighty complexity of the universe, will be more ready to learn and less prone to dispute and dictate. We shall be willing then to read ancient documents of knowledge for what they contain, instead of attempting to force into them our own truth or get them to serve our philosophic or scholastic purposes. And in the passage which we had read already, to enter passively into the thoughts of the old rishis, allow their words to sink into our souls, mold them and create their own reverberations in a sympathetic and responsive material. Submissiveness, in short, to the Shruti was the theory the ancients themselves had of their method of Vedic knowledge. And he says, this is the principle of interpretation that I have followed. And he says, although the ancients were mystics, they were also intuitive. And they were mystic not in the sense of being vague and loose-thoughted visionaries, but in the sense of being intuitional symbolists. And this, again, a passage we had read last time, bears some elaboration. The word mystic comes from the Greek root mist, from which the modern English usage of mist also comes, which means as if a fog through which you do not see clearly, where the identities or the sharp edges, rigidities blur. You sense something beyond. You can perhaps even reach out and touch, but not fully see, not fully know. You are as if in this heightened, lightened, ethereal domain of experience, non-material. And so the mystic generally is one who lives in this domain of a non-material experience. He senses or sees truth, but also knows that there is so much more. The light is there, but the source of the light is not seen. And so the mystic often has a tendency to be vague and loose-thoughted. Often when mystics speak, they speak profound truths sometimes, but they're not always rational. And the intellect has to be suspended or it goes back dissatisfied. So he says mystic not in the sense of vague and loose-thoughted visionaries, but they still see. But here he uses mystic in a different sense, in the sense of being intuitional symbolists, who regarded the world as a movement of consciousness and all material forms and energies as external symbols and shadows of deeper and ever deeper internal realities. And this is the vision of the mystic as an intuitional symbolist. We dwelt on this briefly on Friday. We see the world in terms of forms because of the biological machinery which reduces all contact in terms of rigid shapes, colors, sizes to our mental registering consciousness. But if somehow we allowed our inner senses to see directly, bypassing the biological filters, we would find that something which is far away is as vivid to our seeing as something which is just in front. That which is beyond the wall is as visible to me as that which is in front of the wall. The surface of the wall is as real to my seeing as the inside of the wall and the bricks and the stones and the cement and the sand. It has its own colors, its own textures, and I see them as vividly as the surface. I would see also in this opening of the inner sight that which has happened already, and that which is happening, and that which is about to happen are all equally vivid and real to me. In such a vision, therefore, you can see how space and time begin to blur, or at least the distinctions that our rational mind and sense mind particularly cast on our space-time experience. Those hard edges and rigidities begin to blur. You still see the same things vividly, but you see so much more. And when you allow the pure intuitional vision now to begin to see in its completeness, then you see the world as a movement of consciousness and all material forms and energies as external symbols and shadows of deeper and ever deeper internal realities. Consider now an experience that is quite accessible to us as we are today, that you approach a tree, perhaps to prevent the rigidification of the senses, you close your eyes and rather reach out to feel the tree with your heart. And you feel there a column of energy, a conscious presence, a being who responds to your heart. When you reach out with love from your heart, the tree responds in kind. It is a column of energy which is conscious, which expresses feelings, It has even a kind of a rudimentary thought, and it has intense sensations. As the sun rises, the whole of the tree yearns for the sunlight and reaches out in an intense passion. When the sun rises higher, the whole of the tree reaches out, drawing the light with great joy. As the sun begins to set, the tree yearns once again for the light and then gradually dims its yearning and goes into solitude, quietness, and deep rest. And if you're sitting in a forest, you can feel the whole mood of the forest shift. This is the reality of tree. The particularities of the cellular form and the bark and the color and the texture are all secondary. They are, as it describes, external symbols and shadows of deeper and ever deeper internal realities. Because the reality is this, that when the tree, for whatever reason, loses his enthusiasm, loses the intensity of its energy, loses what we may call joie de vivre, the joy of life, its energies diminish, gradually begin to fade, and this reflects in the particularities of the biological processes. We see now the tree having less leaves, giving less flowers. We see it withering, fading, and then one day suddenly we see that the juice is gone, it has become a dry log. What happened, we don't know. There was a tree in the ashram courtyard that had begun similarly to fade, and the mother communicated with the tree, and the tree told her that it is lonely and it wants to go and join its family in the Nilgiri hills. And mother said, "Don't go away, I will give you a companion." And she had another tree of the same species planted there. And for a while this tree again bloomed, and then again it faded, withered, and died eventually. But this is just to show you that the external biological process is a reflection of the internal reality, which is much more true, which is innately true, not dependent on the biology entirely. The biology depends on the inner reality. The inner does not so much depend on the biology. And I say so much, I qualify it because in the material world, it also depends on the biology. If you cut the tree, well, the reality of the tree in its subtle form is still there. It may drift away because it is no more grounded into matter. It still lives perhaps, but it is no more there materially expressed. So there is a certain dependence, obviously. And if you inject chemicals, the tree begins to suffer and die. But to the inner vision, it will not be the biological process which causes the tree to die. The inner vision, just as it sees the tree as this living being, it sees the chemical as a dark energy. And when that chemical is poured on the roots of the tree, it sees this dark, infectious, destructive energy entering the living, bright energy of the tree. It sees that darkness spreading and extinguishing the light. And therefore the tree dies. To the inner vision, it's not a chemical reaction which killed the tree. It is a negative energy destroying a positive energy that diminished or threw out that energy or dissipated it, and so the tree died. When such an inner vision looks at many of the chemicals we use today, which we pour in our foods, it sees that darkness, it sees the poison, it sees the danger. And unfortunately, if we were to see the whole earth today, we would see the air, the waters, and the soil filled with this very dark vibration, which the human consciousness has created, has extracted, has amplified, and thrown into nature. And the whole earth, on a certain level, is suffocating from this. So the reality that the intuitive consciousness sees is this. the world as a movement of consciousness and all material forms and energies as external symbols and shadows of deeper and ever deeper internal realities. We may ask ourselves then, how do we explain all that material science shows us of the physical form? Well, the explanation is simple. When you see an atom, well, we do not see an atom ever. When you see a molecule, we do not see a molecule ever. When you see a cell of the tissue, you do not see the cell ever. You see the reflection that the cell produces to rays which are shot at it. And the rays themselves are a ripple of energy. So you send a ripple of energy, the energy bounces back, and your mind forms from that pattern an image of a form there. But was there ever a form? From this inner perspective, we say no. There was no rigid form. There was a bundle of energy expressing certain qualities. And when the wave came upon it, it bounced back, reflecting those qualities. And it's those reflections that our mind forms as the rigid images. So yes, there corresponds to each atom a certain imprint of energy, which has its own innate quality. But the atom as we picture it is a mental construction. It is a bundle of energy, a bundle of consciousness held by a certain intention, by Agni, the divine will, which is here the fire emerging from the mouth of the horse, the Vayu, the air of life that it breathes out, and the eyes that see what the fire and the air will form. And when we look at the world in this way, all of this which we touch is nothing but this occult body of the divine moving into manifestation. When you touch the flower, when you gaze upon its form, its beauty and colors, its texture and its perfume, and hear the sound of the bird, you are gazing upon the body of the divine moving into manifestation, bursting out in these infinite rhythms of its infinite qualities, Ananta Guna. And your perceiving mind translates that underlying reality of movement of consciousness into material form, and that's why we call it the sense mind. The mind uses the senses to cast and create in form. This is why the Buddhist tradition says the whole world exists in your mind. It seems strange when it is said in this way, but when you view it from this perspective, you understand why. Your mind creates an image of the world, but the reality of the world is something far more profound. And how profound? He says, external symbols and shadows of deeper and ever deeper internal realities. There are layers and layers and layers we can go into. And the Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upanishad tries to capture something of this vision in the symbol of the horse of the worlds. So, we reread this. He says, the early Vedantists were mystics, not in the sense of being vague and loose-thoughted visionaries, but in the sense of being intuitional symbolists, who regarded the world as a movement of consciousness and all material forms and energies as external symbols and shadows of deeper and ever deeper internal realities. It is not my intention here, nor is it in my limits possible to develop the philosophy of the great Aranyaka Upanishad, but only to develop with just sufficient amplitude for entire clearness the ideas contained in its language and involved in its figures. Sri Aurobindo says this very humbly, but he does reveal so much of the philosophy. The business of my commentary is to lay a foundation. It is for the thinker to build the superstructure. And with this, we complete the foreword of his commentary. The next part of the text moves straight away into the description of the horse of the world, and explaining the symbolism of the first verse, which we will continue next Sunday. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.